The topic for tonight is addiction being a disease. And I think, at this point, one of the most important questions that the loved ones ask is concerning the difference in the debate between is addiction a disease or is addiction a choice? And I think this has been a long-standing question for many, many, many years. So I think it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around the idea that addiction is a disease. If you look at diabetes, for example, with diabetics, they did not choose to get diabetes. But with the drug addict, there's this idea that the drug addict did have the choice to start using drugs. If you look at cancer, for example, this unfortunately befalls an unfortunate person with no fault of their own. They don't wake up one day and decide, you know what, today I'd love to be riddled with cancer. It happens with no choice of their own. But where the controversy comes in with trying to understand addiction as a disease has got more to do with the fact that did they or did they not choose to actually take the drug in the first place? And if that is so, if they can choose to take the drug, then surely it's as simple as making the choice to stop. And if it was that easy, we wouldn't need treatment centers. If it was a matter of choice, we can just wake up and say, you know what, I've noticed that drugs and alcohol are ruining my life, it's causing unmanageability, then why can't we stop? And I think the question is not, why can't we stop? I think the more important question is, why can't we stay stopped? We have clients that go to treatment, and when they come out of treatment, sometimes, after a period of time of recovery and sobriety, they relapse. They've had collateral letters, they've had damage letters, they've seen the consequences of their behavior. Surely, they should not pick up the drug or the alcohol again. What in their sane minds could have possessed them to go back after all of that? And I'm hoping today we can try and just grapple with the idea of addiction being a disease. And I'm going to take you through the entire biochemistry of the brain. And I'm going to do my utmost best to not use the big all the neuro words. I'm going to try and make it as understandable as possible without using all the fancy brain terminology. So yes, we're going to take it from there. So if you can change the slide, please, Kate. Okay, so the first argument that we need to look at is the very, how can I say, the obvious one, the choice argument. So the choice argument argues that addiction can't be a disease because drug taking is a behavior, and all behavior are choices. So the choice argument draws a distinction between behavior and symptoms. So let me put it to you this way. As an experiment, if you take a bottle of alcohol and pour out a glass of, let's say, whiskey in front of an alcoholic and tell them, okay, listen, you've been sober for a couple of months now, but I would like you to take this drink. You would noticeably see the alcoholic be in distress if you put a drink in front of the alcoholic. But once he's about to reach or she's about to reach for the drink, we add a little bit of a twist, okay? So as an experiment, we say, if you take this drink right now, if you choose to take this drink right now, I'm going to put a gun to your head and I'm going to pull the trigger, okay? So the choice argument argues that with a strong enough threat or a strong enough motivation, we can get them to stop. And more than likely than not, that is completely and utterly true, okay? So if given the right motivation, if given a strong enough threat, they won't pick up the drink. But that's in the very moment, okay? That's what the choice argument actually is trying to say. But, when we look at, for example, like a diabetic, okay, they don't really have that choice. You can't put a gun to the head of a diabetic and say, you better bring that blood sugar down to 100 or else. It's not going to work, okay? So that's why they draw a distinction between symptoms and behavior. So if we look at the symptoms, all right, The symptoms like a rash or high blood sugar, those types of symptoms, okay, free will plays no part. We don't hold clients responsible for those symptoms because they can't choose not to have them. And that is why we don't punish or coerce these types of people, because it's inappropriate. So, for example, with a diabetic, you know, when it comes to the blood sugar, that's what I'm talking about. But with addiction, it's a bit different because we're not looking at just pure symptoms. Addiction, we don't break out in a rash. We don't break out with a sore throat. It's not the case. The symptoms for addiction are more behaviors. So we see stealing, cheating, manipulating, lying, hiding things. Those types of behaviors, argumentatively, we could change because behaviors are a choice, and that is where the choice argument puts their feet. So they say that because it's a behavior, drug taking is a behavior. So all behaviors are choices. Free will does exist. The addict is responsible for their behavior. They can quit if they choose to. You just have to motivate them to make the right choice. Okay, so that is basically the choice argument. And it's a very valid argument, but it fails to take into account the brain and our capacity for choice. Next slide, please, Kate. So what we mean by that, okay, is that this is all fair and well. This is all fair and well that, yes, given the right motivation, given the right threat. So, for example, if you don't go to treatment, I'm going to call social services and your children will be taken away. You would think that naturally that in a logical, rational sense would just be enough to motivate the alcoholic or the addict to stop. And quite often it does help them get into treatment, and they do choose to go to treatment, okay? But we're forgetting a very, very vital part that comes with choice, all right? We need to have the capacity in our minds, our brains, our chemistry, our biochemistry, our biology, to have the capacity to make choice. So the disease of addiction basically says that it's not just the disease of addiction. They try to reframe it. It's basically the disease of choice. We have a disease in the part of the brain, a defect in the part of the brain, in many areas of the brain, in fact, that cause difficulty in the processing of making choice. So this is all fair and well if you've got all the right equipment, if I can put it that way. But if you don't have all the right equipment, you can't expect a rational choice to come out on the end of that machine, okay? So that's what the disease of addiction is about. It's more the disease of choice. So I think it's important, before I carry on for a second, to admit upfront that the behavior of addicts can be appalling, okay? And I'm not trying to argue that it's excusable. I'm not trying to condone the behavior at all. That's not the point of this presentation. But the presentation is to show that there is a disorder of the parts of the brain that allow someone to make proper decisions, okay? These behaviors are seen as symptoms of a disease. Addiction is a disease that affects the reward circuit of the brain. And in order to understand this, we have to understand disease in general, okay? So these behaviors are in fact symptoms of a disease. So what we're seeing in our loved ones, what we're seeing in our clients, the behavior that we see are symptoms. It's not the problem, okay? This is what alerts us that there is a problem. So for example, if we take pneumonia, okay, that means that I've got a problem in my lungs. And it might manifest in a cough, it might manifest in a runny nose, it might manifest in sore ears. Now, if we go and try and address the runny nose, the sore throat, and the sore ears, by all means, that will help in those areas. But that hasn't relieved the actual problem being pneumonia. So we have to address it at that level instead of just symptomatically, because there's a far deeper reason as to why these behaviors that you are seeing are coming out on the other side. So that's what the disease of addiction is primarily about. So how do we understand disease, I think, is important before we even get there. So doctors have to follow a certain model to describe what makes a disease. What defines a disease versus an illness versus a moral failing? They use a model called the biomedical model. And this model for disease has been around for over 100 years. And it gives you a clear definition and criteria to try and understand what makes up a disease. Can you change the slide, please, Kate? Okay, so before we get into it, let's find out what a disease actually is. So for the past 100 years, doctors have been using the biomedical model to diagnose diseases. This is what is known as the causal model. It describes and defines what is causing the specific symptoms you are seeing. If you had an incurable illness, say diabetes, okay, the organ has a defect. So if you look on the right-hand side, this is the model that we use. So we have an organ, and that gets a defect, and as a result, we see symptoms. So that is how the biomedical model works. And this is the very simplistic, down-to-earth way of how doctors have diagnosed diseases. And this has been going on for about 100 years. So if we look at diabetes is the disease. The organ that has been defected is the pancreas. The defect in the pancreas is the death of cells that produce insulin, therefore no insulin. And the symptoms that come out is blindness, wounds, numbness. So like I said before, if we had to address, say, possible blindness, possible wounds, possible numbness, if we address that, that doesn't address the problem of no insulin. So what they've done in the past is using this model, if we could figure out what the defect was, okay, because we can't change the organ. Yes, we have stem cell research and so forth, but having a transplant of every single organ that's profound. So we can't necessarily change the organ, but we can address the defect. So with people with diabetes, we give them insulin, and that removes the symptoms. So do doctors go after the symptoms? No, they fix the defect. Similarly, if you had an infection in your lungs, defect, we only address the coughing with cough syrup. That would not rid the problem. But what about addiction? Okay, what is the organ? Is it the brain? Is it the liver? What is the defect exactly? All we really know and have known up until the last 20 years is that the symptoms of addiction is just pure badness. There's just no other way to put it. It just comes out badly. So this is what research over the past 20 years, now that we've got brain scans and CT scans, recent developments have allowed us now to figure out what the defect is and exactly what is the organ. And if we can meet all three of those criteria, we can lawfully and ethically and medically describe it as a disease. Can you change the slide, please, Kate? So I'm going to start to break it down, and let's try and figure out what the organ is. So tonight we're going to basically look at the brain. And I hate to say it, but I'm only addressing half of the problem tonight. So we're going to just look at the brain. So in the brain, the two most important parts of the brain and that relate to addiction, that addiction affects, is the frontal cortex and the midbrain. So as you can see the little picture I've shown you there, the frontal cortex is the front part of the brain. It's up here at the top, okay? And the frontal cortex primarily is responsible for morality. This is the part of the brain that looks at personality. It's where consciousness is housed. Self-awareness comes from this part of the brain. rationality, where we evaluate the world, where we weigh options, where we understand consequences, where we give things emotional meaning, where we attach. So what that means is like how a mother and a child attaches to each other and how a child attaches back to their mother. This is where we select our romantic partners and our friends, where we give things moral meaning, where we give things spiritual meaning, and primarily, and the most important, where choice and decision-making happens. So it's easy to think and see how drugs must somehow break the frontal cortex to create all the addictive behavior and symptoms that our families and loved ones and clients are seeing. It's a powerful idea that drugs work on the frontal cortex and addiction is due to a moral failing or personality disorder or bad upbringing. But to be honest with you, it's wrong. Addiction doesn't start here, and drugs don't start here at all. Where it does start is much, much deeper in the brain and long before it hits this part of the brain that is necessary for making choices. This is the last stop. This is the last stop. But down here in the back of your brain, the midbrain, it starts there first, although it looks, sounds, and feels like it's coming from here. So if we can move to the next slide. Okay, so where addiction starts, where the defect starts, where the problem starts for us is in our midbrain. And the midbrain is the part of the brain also known as the reptilian brain. It's the most animalistic part of our brain. This part of our brain is responsible for keeping us alive. It is necessary for survival. It does not think or make decisions. It does not understand consequences. All this part of your brain is responsible for is the next 15 seconds. It is responsible to get us from one moment to another moment. That's all it cares about. It's the part of the brain that tells us to eat, tells us to defend ourselves. It's also responsible for our sex drive. And to make sure that we do these behaviors, our midbrain makes them pleasurable. So that is very, very important, okay? I forgot where I was now. Oh, yes, okay. So ordinarily, what normally happens if we look at a top-down approach, ordinarily, if everything is functioning fine in the brain, the frontal cortex, the front of the brain, keeps the midbrain in check. It's almost like its bodyguard. It tells it what to do, make sure that it doesn't run wild, okay? It exerts control over the unconscious survival impulses of the midbrain. But in addiction, this top-down approach fails, and the midbrain becomes more powerful in guiding behavior than the cortex. Simply put, in addiction, something goes wrong in brain processing long before morals or personality or choice is even considered. So you can imagine that if normally information comes through and it goes through this whole process and your front of the brain with morality, judgment, rationality, the part of the brain that makes healthy, good decisions, if that part of the brain is second and is not as more powerful than that part of your brain, the midbrain, then you're basically operating from an animalistic survival point of view non-stop. Now, we are not designed to go that way. The brain is not designed to work that way. It's almost back to front. And that's the most layman's term, as I can put it, is it switches the system back to front. And I think at this point, I would be wanting to know why. What is the cause of this? Why does this keep happening? Okay, there are many causes to addiction. There's three primarily, and we're going to get to those a bit later. But I think what's important is, how did we figure this out? How did we find this information historically? Kate, if you could change the slide, please. All right, so drugs work primarily in the unconscious survival midbrain. and not in the rational frontal cortex. We know this because of a very famous rat experiment that was conducted in the 1950s. So this experiment basically proves, okay, that drugs don't work first and foremost here in the frontal cortex. Where drugs work is down in the midbrain. That's where it works first, and it goes all the way there first. So in the 1950s, there was a rat experiment done, and I'd be lying if I could remember the scientist's name right now. But what we can conclude from these experiments is they found that a mouse, they did these experiments on a mouse, and they watched what the mouse would do, and obviously they observe its behavior, and we can learn a lot from them. So this study showed that they found that a mouse will press a lever to deliver a tiny electric current, if you can imagine this, to a very small but very specific areas of the brain, two specific areas. It's the ventral tegmental area, we just call it the VTA, and the nucleus accumbens, which is just the NA. So that, don't worry about the names, but these two parts of the brain are responsible for pleasure. They are very, very important when it comes to pleasure and reward. That's what those two parts of the brain are for. So they found that this little mouse will press this lever and deliver a tiny electric shock to those two parts of the brain. And not only will a mouse press a lever to deliver a current to these two areas of the brain, that's all he will do. He won't eat, he won't mate with other mice. If you put an electric grate on this lever, okay, and shock the mouse, he won't step off the grate. He would just keep pressing and pressing and pressing, delivering this current over and over and over again, no matter what, unfortunately, until the mouse dies. Okay, so this is how we discovered the pleasure center of the brain. Now, our brains have the same two areas. So mice have it, and so do we. And the nerve pathway that runs between them is known as the pleasure circuit. So we'll get into why that's important. So based on these experiments, scientists wanted to see the impact, not just of an electric current, but of drugs, and if in any way it acted in the same way. And they found that it did. So later scientists discovered that a mouse will press a lever to deliver drugs to these same two areas again and again and again. And that's all the mouse will do. They won't eat, they won't mate, they won't play, they won't move. They will just keep doing it until they unfortunately die. So what these studies show, and why this is so important, is because these studies show how drugs hijack the midbrain. And now it goes into the #1 spot for survival. So you can imagine our brains, the survival parts of our brains, are necessary to make sure that we eat, we sleep, we drink water. That is what's necessary for survival, okay? But these mechanisms, the solution to starvation, the solution to drinking water, the solution for feeling lonely, what happens now is that the drug becomes the solution. We no longer want to eat for survival. We no longer want to drink water because we're thirsty. It's almost like it hijacks the brain in the sense that if an addict feels hungry, they don't think of food, they think of using. When an addict is thirsty, for example, they don't think of water, they think of drugs and alcohol. And that's what happens in the long run. They hijack the brain. So the drug and survival mechanisms, there starts to become a blur between the two. And that blur between drugs and survival kind of morphs into each other. And the drug now equals survival. Now, I know that sounds very, very, very confusing, but if I had to put that into context, so imagine I left you in a desert, and I left you in a desert for 2 weeks with no water, no food. You're out there, you've been starving, you're sunburned, you're dehydrated, and it's just not okay. And after 2 weeks, you find me at this beautiful buffet in the middle of the desert, and I've got Coca-Cola, and I've got KFC, I don't know, maybe some people like a vegetarian platter. I'm not too sure, but I've got a whole range of things for you on offer. And you come to me and you say to me, please, can I have some? And I'm not having a really good day. And I say to you, no, you cannot. You can't have anything on this buffet. What do you think a person would do in that moment after being starved, after not having water? It doesn't matter if this person is a renowned cop. It doesn't matter if they are a man of the church. It doesn't matter if this is a dutiful wife. It doesn't matter if this is a 12-year-old child. It doesn't matter if this person is an addict or an alcoholic. Stigma, race, gender, creed, religion, none of that matters anymore. The morality goes out the window. That human being will do anything and everything, and immoral things, could even push it that far, to get what they need for survival. And that is what happens in addiction, is that the drugs become the number one source of survival. And that's what these experiments had shown us. Can you change the slide, please, Kate? Sorry, I just can't see anything. Sorry, guys. I've got load shedding, so I'm doing the best I can. Okay, so now that we have these experiments, and now we know how drugs play a role in our pleasure sense, which is the neural pathway that runs from the VTA to the NA. That part of the brain, the midbrain, responsible for pleasure and for reward. Now that we know that there's an issue there, we can look at it in context. So in addiction, something goes wrong with the very part of the brain we use to distinguish those things that are good for survival and from those things that are harmful for survival. We can't tell the difference anymore. We call this the brain's pleasure sense. So in addiction, something goes wrong with the very part of the brain that we use to tell these things apart. We can tell the difference between broccoli and chocolate cake, okay? And why do we have a pleasure sense? Because we have to tell the difference between broccoli and chocolate cake. So in terms of survival, if we're starving to death and someone brings you a plate of broccoli, you need a pleasure sense to know that that is not going to save your life at all. But if someone brings you a massive chocolate cake, that will save your life. So that is the reason for having it. We need to distinguish good for survival, bad for survival. Now, in addiction, something goes wrong there. It goes horribly wrong there. So to identify and prioritize these things in the environment that are good for survival, the midbrain makes them pleasurable. Now, that is incredibly, incredibly important. So in order for us to be able to distinguish good for survival and harmful for survival, the brain, normal brains, are naturally designed to make them pleasurable. Because if it's pleasurable, we can remember it. We remember things that are more pleasurable than things that bring dissatisfaction. That is how our brain stores memory. It's by making it pleasurable, giving off a reward. And in addiction, something goes wrong at the very part of the brain we use for this. Okay. In addiction, this is the sense that breaks. So if you can't perceive light correctly, so if this sense breaks and we can't perceive the difference between the two, okay, so if I had to put that in context, if you can't perceive light correctly, that's called blindness. No one is going to question your morality. If you can't perceive sound correctly, that's called deafness. And no one is going to try and arrest you or take away your children if you are deaf. But the word pleasure is very, very morally loaded. So perhaps you can see that a person with a defect in their pleasure sense is far more likely to be interpreted as being immoral. What addiction is a defect in the brain's ability to perceive, process, and then act upon pleasurable experiences. So that is what addiction is. I'm going to just repeat that. The brain's ability, it is a defect in the brain's ability to perceive, process, and then act upon pleasurable experiences. We have a defect in the pleasure part of the mind. That is why they call it a disease. Now, we've seen partially what the defect is, we've seen partially what the organ is, and we're seeing now slowly but surely the symptoms are coming out. Okay. So I think before we move on to why, I think it's important for us to figure out how do we create a pleasurable experience, because it plays a massive role in understanding the disease of addiction. If we can have the next slide, please, Kate. Okay, so I think what I was trying to describe earlier is that different areas of the brain handle different functions. Okay, it's almost like different places in the brain are responsible for hearing, for seeing, for processing. So different areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. We use neural pathways. These are like the bridges that connect these areas of the brain to communicate from one area to another, which helps the brain assemble its processing into complete thoughts and perceptions. So when the brain creates a pleasurable experience, it brings together several levels of processing together into one experience. So if you had to think of the example of eating a cookie, okay, and you wanted to eat not just like any cookie, but one of those beautiful, beautiful cookies from France, or have one of those elite coffees that you haven't had in a very long time, one of those very special ones, one that sticks out more than others. What it will do, our brains will do, in order to create a pleasurable experience, it will bring the smell, the reward, the taste, the place that you had it, the associated memories, maybe, you know, from your childhood, even the emotions from how you experienced it the first time. It will bring it all together into a single sensation. So there are multiple levels of processing that an experience from the outside comes in, that it uses to create a pleasurable experience. Now, we don't experience these different levels individually. You won't feel it separate from each other. The brain weaves them together to form a unified perception, and it happens really quickly. But in addiction, something goes wrong at each and every level of processing, right down from our genes all the way up until they make a choice. Those neural pathways that connect from genes to the reward system, to the memory, to the stress relief system, to the choice system, that entire neural pathway, there is a problem at each and every stop. It's not just one area. There is an issue and a defect in every single one. And obviously, if you think about a car, if you put in the incorrect petrol, so not even petrol actually, if say you poured cream soda in a car, I don't know who would do that, but you know, let's put cream soda in a car. If you put the wrong petrol in the car, it will affect the engine, and the engine will affect the sound of the car and the way you drive the car. And that car could then go off the road, you could lose control, the brakes might fail, and you might crash that car. We're sitting in a position where we see the crashed car, and we're wondering, why did you drive? Why did you drive? But we need to stop and ask ourselves if everything prior to that allowed for safe driving. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at when it comes to the brain processing. If something goes wrong at a genetic level, it will affect the reward system. And if there's something wrong in the reward system, it will then topple over and affect the memory system, and so forth and so forth. The part of the brain necessary for rational decision making, it comes out a bit sideways. And I think that is a minimization of the experiences of some of our families. And when I say comes out sideways, we're looking at jails, we're looking at institutions, we're looking at theft, debt, bankruptcy, child neglect. I mean, I don't mean to minimize it, but it does come out as badness, like I said previously. So in addiction, something goes wrong at each and every level of processing. So what happens is you can basically think of it as if we have 5 different levels of processing. They're not individual. What they do is they weave themselves together like this. And when they weave themselves like this, we have one single sensation. And we just go, yum, that cookie was divine, okay? But in addiction, there's an issue at each one. So what happens is it's almost like pleasure unwoven. It kind of separates itself like this, and they don't connect. So there is a video on this that I can post the link afterwards as well, just so it can explain to you in a video. But I'm going to try my best to explain each level to you and what has caused this, and hopefully this will make more sense. Just the next slide, please, Kate. So let's start at the genetic level. So the very first part that the illness affects in the midbrain is genetics. So 40 to 60% of addicts and alcoholics are addicts and alcoholics purely because of genetics. So if you look back in the family history, you'll often find a 40 to 60% likelihood that there is a history of addiction in the family. And that can go all the way back. There might be a recessive gene, which means that the person could be genetically vulnerable to getting the illness, to having the disease, okay? If you look back in your history, we're not just looking at drugs and alcohol, we're also looking at process addictions. So anyone in the family that has, an obsession and a compulsion towards work, gambling, love, sex, food, maybe an eating disorder. Sometimes there's a relationship between OCD. There's also mental illnesses in the family that could have been passed down. But what's important to know is that there's a 40 to 60% relationship, that this is genetic, okay? What genes helps us understand is, yes, okay, so maybe I have the gene, okay? But if, for example, if you look at my family, my brother and myself come from the same mom, the same dad. We grew up in the same environments. We experienced the same traumas. But my brother never got addicted. Okay, why would the one, myself, have to have gone through recovery and so forth? But why did my brother not get it? What happened there? So yes, having the gene makes you more vulnerable to getting the disease. But what's important is that there needs to be an environmental trigger to trigger it. So very similar to cancer. We all have cancer cells, but it's something from the environment that must trigger it in order for us to get cancer. And why that is very important is because environments and experiences, our environments that we grow up in, the experiences that a person goes through are powerful enough, believe it or not, to shape our genetics. So if we, for example, are exposed to an environment that is, harmful, like a child who gets bullied at school, that kind of trauma, that kind of experience does have the capacity, does have the power to shape genetics. And the moment we start shaping them and triggering them and changing them, that genetic vulnerability can make someone susceptible to the disease of addiction. So that's the first part that it starts in there. Now, if we have the gene, then that means that can affect the reward system. So we go down into the reward system. The reward system, very basically put, the reward system is responsible for releasing a hormone called dopamine. In layman's terms, a lot of people understand dopamine to be the happy hormone, the hormone that makes us feel happy. That's not necessarily just what dopamine is for. Dopamine, its job, tells the brain when a reward is important, noticeable, and better than expected. It's released from the midbrain. It tells the brain to pay attention to that reward. So that is, it's more like the hormone that teaches us. So if I have cake for the first time and I've never had cake before, dopamine will be released so that it can tell the brain, oh my goodness, this was better than ever expected. Then you have, so for example, carrot cake. I'm not a fan. And it's not better than the chocolate cake. your brain won't release as much dopamine because it wasn't better than expected. So dopamine is only released when something is experienced and it is important and noticeable and worthy and salient. So dopamine is released to make you remember and understand that this, pay attention here, this is great. If you do the same thing and it was not better than expected, the brain releases less dopamine. So technically you experience dissatisfaction. Each time the addict uses a drug, the brain gets a message that the drug was better than expected, even though it's not. Dopamine also serves to tell the brain what it wants, not just what it likes. This is why addiction is persistent drug use despite negative consequences. And this does not matter what drug it is. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care what drug it is. Even process addictions release unnatural dopamine levels, which trick the brain and replace normal reward or pleasure. So we are not designed, our bodies are not designed to have those types of levels of dopamine at all. And when we use intoxicants, and it doesn't matter what whatever, sorry, I can't say that word right now. It doesn't matter which one, even sex, gambling, eating, codependency, those types of behaviors release spikes of dopamine. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the manifestation of the illness is. The release of dopamine is unnatural. It's not supposed to be that high. So obviously that would take preference and priority over normal things that release dopamine, like holding a child, enjoying a nice meal. So what happens then if our dopamine levels and the release of dopamine is unnatural and out of balance? It's then going to affect the memory system. So that has a ripple effect on the memory system. So our memory system has a hormone. The hormone that the memory system releases is called glutamate. Now, glutamate is the neurochemical for memory. Once the brain has found something good for survival, it has to remember it. It has to remember it. So it uses glutamate, but drugs cause a surge of dopamine that it locks this behavior into memory, and everything associated with that drug taking is also locked into the memory. So the people they were with, the places, the things they were doing at the time of day associated with that surge becomes part of the memory. So they go up at the same rate together. So glutamate is also responsible for motivation. So it will then trigger a desire to seek out the drugs. Dopamine says, I want, and glutamate says, okay, go get it. Dopamine says, this is important. This is so important. Glutamate says, never forget this. Hold on to this. Never forget this. With continued and repeated drug use, these memories become hypo-memories, and normal pathways become weaker and weaker. These can become permanent, replacing pathways for functional coping. They learn how drug taking is the only way they can feel happy. So almost like I was talking to one of my colleagues today, she had such a great analogy for this. If you walk in a park and you find those pathways to the swing, everyone walks on that path and they keep walking on that path, and the path gets deeper and deeper, the sand erodes, and that's like our neural pathways, okay? So what happens then is that all the other pathways start to become less important. It is that pathway that gets taken, that highway. It just keeps going and going. So in addiction, when we try to work with our loved ones and our clients, what we're trying to do is to create new neural pathways so that the other one, the grass, can grow over. It will never go away, but we are trying to make it less important. That's why we advocate for abstinence. The longer our loved ones are abstinent, the more time we have to create new neural pathways, new memories, new dopamine experiences, and try to restore or cover up and avoid that one-track path to the swing. Okay, just the next slide, please. So if we have an issue with our genes, it's going to affect the reward system, the dopamine, and then it's going to affect our memory. Now, once we've affected all of those, it has a ripple effect on our stress system. Now, the stress system, the hormone released in this system, is CRF. It is a really big name, so I'm just going to say CRF for now. So what CRF is responsible for, it acts to counteract dopamine when it's out of balance. So if dopamine gets too high or out of control, CRF pushes back to try and equalize it. If the stress system is overly stimulated, i.e. using drugs, the brain gives up and reverts to changing its set point benchmark for balance. It almost resets its pleasure benchmark. Even though, yes, it balances out, what happens then is that normal pleasure is no longer registered. It falls below the normal person's happy mark. Now, anytime the brain is stressed, it remembers that nothing other than the drug or the using behavior and its associations derive pleasure. So again, we've moved into the number one spot. And when I'm stressed, use. When I'm stressed, drink. When I get stressed, go out and party. When I'm stressed, go to a strip club. And it just, the same behavior, the same path is taken the whole time. So as you can imagine, if this happens and normal levels of happy are no longer normal, that affects choice. Now we're up in the front. Now that whole process has gone from the midbrain through our pleasure circuit, all the way through the neural pathways, through the 5 processing, all the way up. Now we're at the front. And now the addict or the alcoholic is supposed to, at this point, make a healthy, rational decision. And at that point, it is too late. Once it gets there, like I said, if you're putting cream soda in a car, the output is not going to be sufficient healthy driving. The car is probably going to crash. It's the same with information and memories and the drug using behavior that starts down at the bottom. It's going to come out at the top now in the frontal cortex where we make decisions. So all that problematic processing before now arrives at the frontal cortex necessary for rational decision making. The frontal cortex is completely dependent on all prior stages of processing. It cannot make rational moral judgments or healthy choices if the information delivered to it was unhealthy. This is why the addict appears compelled to use, why they do not care about anything other than using, why they lie and steal and manipulate. Next slide, please, Kate. So to summarize, if I can just, there was a study done to try and see how much dopamine is released at various points. So when they did this study, what they discovered was on a great day, take a great day. So on a day where you're about to wake up, you're about to get married, you're about to go on your first date, it's the day you're collecting your puppy for the first time that you've been waiting for. On a great day, a day that there's anticipation and you're looking forward to it. The brain on a natural level will release around about 60 nanograms of dopamine. Okay, that is, again, the hormone necessary for you to remember and to say, pay attention, this is important. On a bad day, so say a day where you have to get up and you're going to have to go to a funeral, or you're about to get called in by your boss, one of those days that you are not looking forward to at all, on a bad day, the brain only releases 40 nanograms of dopamine. They saw and found, and maybe this might shock some, is that during sex, that only 80 nanograms is released, and that is less than eating pleasurable food, having a meal, and that releases 90 nanograms. What they then looked at is what one line of drugs, one shot of drugs, however you want to describe it, when you take one shot, it releases 1,100 nanograms of dopamine. Now you can imagine that that is not normal. That is not what our brains were designed to do at all. So if we had to look at it in terms of a graph, if you can just watch my mouse here, if a drug is taken here, the dopamine is going to spike. It's just going to spike right up. And if dopamine spikes, glutamate is going to follow. It's going to go, oh yes, it's important. So now dopamine rises and glutamate goes, oh my gosh, this is so important. remember, 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 and it will lock it in right there. And then what will happen is the next time they take or drink, it will be okay, but it won't be as high. It won't release as much dopamine because it wasn't more important or better than expected. So what they do then is take, say, 2 lines and a couple of shots of vodka there, and then woof, up goes the dopamine because that was better than expected. And then your glutamate will follow, and it will go, remember this, this is good for survival. Now what happens is here becomes the level of happy. This is now happy. This is now solution. This is now survival. So what happens is with the stress system, that CRF hormone, that creates a homeostasis. So if this is the level of happy, and this is the normality, this is normal dopamine, this is not normal, then the stress system will raise the bar, and it will raise the bar up here to this being the new normal. This is the new normal. So now you find your loved ones at this point are not enjoying food, they're not enjoying their relationships, they're not having good days, they appear depressed and anxious and sad and lonely and hopeless and angry and all of these things. Nothing touches sides because this is the memory of happy. That's what happens in the brain. And because this is the memory of happy, nothing else matters. Nothing else. When they're sad, this is what they're after. They don't want to go to their friend and have a conversation. They don't want to go to the mall. They don't want to wash their bodies or wash their hair. None of that releases dopamine close to what they're after. So what happens is they chase this. But if you use, say, you start with 1 drink, we're over there. And then we have 1 drink again, it might release maybe 900. And another 1 drink, maybe 800. And they start to feel dissatisfied. So now they're drinking 3 drinks and they're chasing this. And then they drink 3 drinks for a couple of months and it drops again. And then they go, you know what, let's have 3 drinks and 4 lines of cocaine. Oh, and now we're back up here. So you can see how the progression of the illness starts to take place. And it goes up and up and up. They're using more and more and more because they're chasing a memory, a false, fraudulent, not real memory of this kind of happiness. So that's just to try and summarize those 5 stages. And that also speaks to why they crave as well. Can you just change the slide, please, Kate? So, like I said right in the beginning, the disease of addiction is better understood as the disease of choice. It's a disease that affects the choice-making system and affects the capacity for choice. So now we know what the organ is. The organ is the midbrain. The defect is stress-induced pleasure dysfunction. There's a dysfunction in the pleasure system. And the symptoms that come out is loss of control, craving, persistent use despite negative consequences. Now that we have this model, we know that here is not where we need to operate. Where we need to operate is here. So the 3 main causes for relapse is dopamine spikes. Spiking of dopamine in any shape or form is one of the things that causes relapse. The second thing would be any behavior or relation to using. So the associates, the people, the places, the things, the triggers, avoiding those as far as humanly possible, because those things will trigger a cascade of memory and that they will fall back into that rut. They will go straight back into that neural pathway all the time. So that's the second one. And the third one is stress. The more stress a client feels and the more stressful situations they're in, the more likely they are to relapse because it affects the whole system and kicks in craving. So there is one more slide. I wanted to put this out here. The word sane being the operative word. No one in their sane mind wakes up and chooses to cheat and destroy their loved ones. No one in their sane mind wakes up and chooses to neglect their children, chooses to gamble their house away, and chooses to destroy themselves. So we are not treating, we are treating an illness. We are not treating a moral failing. We're not treating a lack of choice. Because if they had the choice, and even if they wanted to choose, it's almost like they have a disease of where there's no choice. They have no choice but to make the same choice every single time. And that is why we know that it's an illness. It's not, they're not choosing to act this way. Even if they don't want to, they are compelled to do so. Even despite their best intentions, their every promise, I promise I will never do it again. I don't want to lose my children. That does not override it. Remember, this part of the brain, the midbrain, is way more powerful now than the front. So this sounds like they mean it, but this is what is powerful, and it is way more powerful. So the first step in AA and NA is we try to help them see what we admitted, that we were powerless and we cannot manage our own lives. We admit that we are powerless. We cannot change the brain. So we have to live a new way of life. Like I said earlier, that's just half of the problem. So when I do my next presentation, I'll deal with the other half of the problem, which is the liver, which would also explain the compulsion to use. This explains the obsession, that nothing else matters. This is all they think about. That explains the disease of obsession and perception. There is also the part where there is the disease of the body and the liver. And I will cover that in about 2 weeks' time as well. So yes, I just wanted to wrap up with this short little video, and then I'll open up for questions. Thank you. Kate, I don't think there's sound. I don't know if it's just me.
I can't hear it either, Shani.
I think there's an option to share audio with it.
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
I'm at a party when a kid asks me, "Hey, you want a drink, bro?" No thanks, I don't drink anymore. That's fucking lame. Motherfucker. Lame, weak, sometimes thinking of being boring. So I'm boring. The parties I usually go to consist of coffee and feelings. A few times a week, we sit in a circle and try to piece our lives together. We remember them so clearly. Besides, bro, one time, when only weighing 130 pounds, I killed a bottle of Jack Daniels in 30 minutes. The next morning, I woke up in the backseat of my car naked and neck deep in leaves. I am allergic to alcohol. Every time I drink, I break out in handcuffs. I cracked on a living room carpet and then kicked down a door. To date, I put 3 cats on a treadmill, 1 dog in a cupboard. Do not call me boring, sir. Once, I forgot where my house was escorted by strangers carrying 50 cookies and an umbrella, butt naked. But one time, I headbutted my best friend so hard I shattered his nose. And one time, I took more pills than I could remember and accepted I'd be dead within the hour. Don't you dare call me weak. I have swallowed more pints of regret than you pump blood through your body. Tell my father it was boring. To look his only son in the eyes, tell him if he drank one more time, you would not be welcome in this house. Tell my mother I am weak. She who spelled the whole back tears, driving me home from the psych ward. She who see the son handcuffed to an emergency room bed. She spent 4 years for my sobriety nightly. You will not take this from her. If you offer me a shot, there better be a trigger involved. Yeah. The strongest I have ever felt. The first time I said no to a drink. I have said no every morning since September 29th, 2008. I say no 18 times before breakfast, one for every step it takes to get from my bedroom to the fridge. I say no 10 times before work, one for every billboard that tells me I was stronger when I was drinking. I've said no more times than I can count. One for every night my family lay awake trying not to imagine my headstone. You ask me the question, I did not hear the words you are saying. I hear you ask me, do you want to die, Michael? No, I don't want to die anymore.